Welcome, come on in to Sunday School Teachings. My name is Imelda Trevino Ingman, and I am the youth minister at Creative Worship Center, a global ministry based out of Redford, Michigan. Senior pastor is the Reverend Dr. Cecilia Greenbrier. This week we journey through 1 Kings. It is the 11th book of the Bible and has 22 chapters. Its author is unknown, though ancient Jewish tradition attribute the book to the prophet Jeremiah. Let's journey together through 1 Kings. 1 Kings begins with David's final days and King Solomon's ascent to the throne are covered in this book, followed by the division of the kingdom after its first 100 years. The purpose of 1 Kings is to contrast the lives of those who live for God and those who refuse to do so through the history of the kings of Israel and Judah. And it also reveals to us the role of the prophets. So let's continue our journey. 1 Kings can be explained in two sections. First, the United Kingdom, which is chapters 1 through 11. The divided kingdom is the second half of the book, covering chapters 12 through 22. So taking a closer look at the United Kingdom. In the opening of this section, we learn that Solomon becomes the king. King David instructs Solomon to walk in God's ways, like the instructions from Moses, Joshua, and Samuel to the people, to keep the covenant of God. After David dies, though, his words run hollow through Solomon. Solomon conspires on how he is going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. He is not off to a very good start. You know, Solomon's brightest moment as king is when he asks God for wisdom, and God is pleased at this request and approves. Solomon begins a building production, which included the temple of his father David desired and prepared for him to do. He began building the temple 480 years after the exile from Egypt, 7 years after the ark was brought to the temple. The glory of the Lord ascended on it. Solomon prayed a powerful prayer, and then sacrifices were made. The temple is described as the Garden of Eden, a place where heaven and earth meet and God's presence dwells. After the temple is completed is when the kingdom really starts to fall apart. Solomon, although the wisest king ever, did not always exercise his wisdom. He begins to marry daughters of other kings for political alliances. He also begins to worship the God of his wives, introduces those gods to the people of Israel, and is subdued by the lust for women. He even institutes slave labor for building his projects. So you may recall God's law, also known as the Torah, in Deuteronomy 17. All that was written, that Solomon is breaking all these laws. His downfall is looming, and he died shortly after that. Let's continue our journey and learn about the divided kingdom. The second half of the book shows the beginning of the end of the United Kingdom of Israel, the demise of Jerusalem, and the exile to Babylon. This section opens with Samuel's sons Rehoboam as king and acting just like his father. It is a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. So under the leadership of Jeroboam, Solomon's other son, the northern tribes reject this and rebel. They succeed and form their own kingdom, whose capital eventually becomes Samaria. To compete with Rehoboam, Jeroboam builds 2 temples and 2 golden calves to represent, of all things, the God of Israel. And now the kingdom is split in 2 rival kingdoms. Jeroboam is crowned king of Israel. the 10 tribes become the northern kingdom, and the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin become the southern kingdom of Judah, centered in Jerusalem, with the kings from the line of David. So during this period, the story goes back and forth and tracing the faith of these kingdoms, all the tragedy that has occurred. It just traces the detail of that. And the author at this point in time takes the opportunity to compare each of the kingdoms happen to have 20 kings ruling through their kingdoms during this time period. And the author compares each king from the kingdoms to God's criteria for king. He asks and he poses, did the king worship the God of Israel alone? He also asked if the king rid Israel of idolatry. Did they remain faithful to the covenant of David? So did they become corrupt and unjust? Well, here are the results. The northern kingdom had 0 of 20 kings that followed the criteria, while the southern kingdom had 8 of the 20 kings that followed the criteria. So this leads us to another purpose of the book, the role of the prophet. They are key figures in Israel's history. Prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel. They played the role of covenant. They watched over the covenant, which is what which they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to the light, to be a light to the nations, and they should obey God, obey his laws, obey the Torah. So the prophets were challenging the kings and the people to repent. There was 2 prominent prophets during this period that God raised, and they were Elijah and Elisha. Elisha eventually takes over for Elijah when he passes away. So Elijah was a prophet over the northern kingdom and was known as a wild man living in the desert. His greatest nemesis was the evil king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two they instituted worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. So Elijah challenges 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both built altars and prayed their gods to their gods, but only the God of Israel answered with fire. Then we have Jezebel, had Naboth, a farmer, falsely accused of insulting the king and had him stoned to death by the nobles and the elders. So why did this lead up to a stoning? Ahab wanted to use Naboth's vineyard as a vegetable garden because it was close to his palace. But Naboth told the king that the Lord had instructed him to give this vineyard to his descendants. And so Jezebel swings into play by falsely accusing him and having him stoned to death. And then tells Ahab the garden's all his. The vineyard is all his for his garden. Then the Lord had Elijah to meet with Ahab and tell him that God was very angry about Naboth's death. Elijah told him that because of his sins and those of his family, disaster would be upon him and his descendants. He went on to say that he would make his house like Jeroboam's. He also said that God was displeased with Jezebel and two, and that dogs would eat those that belonged to Ahab when they died in the city. When the king heard this, he tore his clothing and put on sackcloth. He said he also fast, and he walked meekly around. Then God told Elijah that Ahab had humbled himself before the Lord, and because of this, the Lord would not cause this disaster to occur while Ahab was living. But the Lord went on to tell Elijah that the disaster would occur in his son's lifetime. There was peace between Israel and Aram for about 3 years. Then the king of Judah, Jehoshaphat, went to see Ahab and told him about Ramoth Gilead. Then Ahab told his officials that Ramoth Gilead was occupied by the king of Aram, but it really belonged to Israel. He asked Jehoshaphat if he would fight with him to take back Ramoth Gilead. Jehoshaphat told Ahab that he would, but he should ask the Lord first. So when the prophet Micaiah arrived, he asked if he should go to war. Ahab said, "Please don't leave anything out. Tell me what the Lord is telling you. Tell me the truth and reveal what the Lord is revealing to you." Micaiah told him he saw the people of Israel scattered like sheep because they did not have a shepherd. And God told him that the people should go back home in peace. Micaiah went on to say that someone would entice him to fight, and that if Ahab returned safely, then God had not spoken to him. Ahab and Jehoshaphat, along with their men, went to Ramoth Gilead anyway to battle Aram. King Ahab went into battle disguised as Jehoshaphat. The enemy thought that that was Ahab, but when they learned it was not, they stopped pursuing him, and Ahab was hit by a stray arrow in an opening in his armor. He left the battle, and later that evening he died. Ahab's body was brought back to Samaria, where he was buried as promised by the Lord. Ahab's son succeeded him as king and reigned for 2 years. He sinned because he followed the ways of his mother and father, and, and he also worshiped Baal just like his father, with which made God extremely angry. Now let's continue our journey and look into the themes shared in this book. First, the king, wise, powerful, and achievement. Wisdom, wise, and achievement do not come from human source. They are from God. Solomon's wisdom, power, and achievements brought honor to the Israelite nation and to God. All the kings of Israel and Judah were told to obey God and to govern according to his laws, but their tendencies to abandon God's commands and to worship other gods led them to change their religion and government in order to meet their personal desires. This neglect of God's law led to their downfall. The temple, a beautiful house of worship, doesn't always guarantee heartfelt worship of God. Solomon's temple was a beautiful place of worship and prayer. The sanctuary was a center of Israel's religion. It was a place of God's special presence and housed the Ark of the Covenant containing the Ten Commandments. But then we have the other gods. Although the Israelites had God's law and experienced his presence among them, they were often attracted to other gods. When this happened, their hearts became cold to God's law. The people took on the false qualities of the false gods they worshipped. They became cruel, power hungry, and sexually perverse. And this resulted in the ruin of families and government, eventually led to the destruction of the entire nation. The prophet's message. A prophet's responsibility was to confront and correct any deviation from God's law. Elijah brought a bullet of judgment against Israel. His messages and miracles were a warning to the evil and rebellious kings and the people. The Bible, the truth in sermons, and the wise counsels of believers are warnings to us. Sin and repentance Each king had God's command, a priest or prophet, and the lessons of the past to draw him back to God. All the people had the same resources. Whenever they repented and returned to God, God heard their prayers and forgave them. In summary, as we read First Kings, we learn about Solomon's and Elijah's character. Solomon is portrayed as a great wisdom, wealth, and power beyond either of the previous kings of the country, but as a king who sinned. His sins included idolatry, marrying foreign women, and ultimately turning away from God, which led the kingdom to be torn into the into during the reign of his son Ramoth. As for Elijah's character, first off, his name means Yahweh is my God. Elijah is truly one of the greatest prophets. He defeated the prophets of Baal in Mount Carmel. Despite incredible opposition, Elijah stood for God and proved that one plus God is a majority. If God is on your side, no one can stand against you. And that is Romans 8:31. So, as we continue here, one of the most popular verses in First King is found in the second chapter, verse 3. Observe the requirements of the Lord our God and follow all his ways. Keep the decrees, commands, regulations, and laws written in the law of Moses so that you will be successful in all you do and wherever you go. Now, I invite you as a family. There are so many beautiful classical stories in First Kings. I invite you to sit as a family and start reading jointly and sharing with one another. I want to thank you for journeying with me through the first book of Kings. Be blessed.